The Lives of the Saints by Father Alban Butler, April 28th, St. Paul of the Cross. St. Paul of the Cross, founder of the Passionists, was born in Ovada, Republic of Genoa, in 1604, almost at the same time as Voltaire. Paul Francis was the eldest son of Lucas Danet, a businessman of good family. Both he and his wife were excellent Christians. Whenever Paul began to cry for any reason, his mother would show him the crucifix and talk to him about the sufferings of Christ. Thus, little by little, she formed in the child a great devotion to the Passion, which was to distinguish him all his life. Francis's father read the lives of the saints in the family and exhorted his children to beware of the dangers of gambling and lawsuits. Although Paul was one of those select souls who give themselves to God from childhood, at the age of 15, a sermon he heard left him convinced that he did not correspond sufficiently to grace. So, after making a general confession, he undertook a life of austerity. He slept on the floor, spent several hours of the night in prayer, and took severe disciplines. In these practices, he was imitated by his brother, John the Baptist, 2 years his junior. He also founded a kind of society of mutual sanctification with his friends, several of whom later entered religious life. In 1714, Paul left for Venice to answer the call of Pope Clement XI, who had asked for volunteers for the war against the Turks. But a year later he discharged himself, convinced that he was not cut out for military life. Feeling that God was not calling him to an ordinary life in the world either, he turned down a large inheritance and a brilliant marriage. But before he or his directors succeeded in discovering his true devotion, he lived for several years at his parents' home in Castellazzo in Lombardy, where, through the constant practice of prayer, he reached a high degree of contemplation. In 3 extraordinary visions he had, in 1720, he observed a black habit on which was engraved the name of Jesus in white characters under a cross at the level of the chest. In the 3rd of these visions, the Blessed Virgin, dressed in the black habit, ordered him to found a congregation whose members would wear that habit and suffer constantly for the passion and death of Christ. Paul submitted a written account of his visions to the Bishop of Alexandria, who consulted with several persons of authority, among whom was the Capuchin Columbanus of Genoa, Paul's former spiritual director. Knowing the heroic life of virtue and prayer that the young man had led since he was a child, they all declared that it was indeed a vocation appointed by God. The bishop then authorized Paul to follow the divine call and conferred on him the black habit. He reserved the insignia of the cross until the Pope approved the new foundation. Paul immediately began to draw up the rules of the future congregation. For 40 days he withdrew to a dark and damp triangular cell adjoining the sacristy of the church of St. Charles of Castellazzo, where he lived on bread and water and slept on a bed of straw. The rules he drew up at that time, without consulting any book, are substantially the same as those observed by the Passionists today. After that retreat, he remained for some time with John the Baptist and another disciple in the vicinity of Castellazzo, helping the clergy in catechesis and giving missions with great success. But he soon realized that, in order to fully accomplish his mission, he needed the approval of Rome. So, barefoot, bareheaded, and without a penny in his pocket, he set out for the Eternal City. In Genoa, he left his brother John the Baptist. As soon as he arrived in Rome, he presented himself at the Vatican, but, as he had no credentials, he could not enter. Paul saw in this a sign that God's hour had not yet struck, and he calmly set out on his return journey. He passed by the solitary slopes of Monte Argentaro, which the sea separates almost entirely from the peninsula. He was so impressed by the sight that soon after he returned with John the Baptist, determined to lead in one of the abandoned hermitages there a life as austere as that of the Desert Fathers. Later they spent some time in Rome, where they received holy orders, but in 1727 they returned to Monte Argentaro with the intention of founding the first novitiate, for which they had already received pontifical authorization. In the undertaking they had to face numerous difficulties. All the first candidates found the regime of life too hard and turned back. Moreover, because of the threat of war, the benefactors were unable to keep their promises. Finally, a serious epidemic broke out in the surrounding villages. Paul and John the Baptist, who had received missionary faculties in Rome, devoted themselves to giving the last sacraments to the dying, caring for the sick, and reconciling sinners with God. The missions they preached at that time were so successful that they soon began to be called from other towns. Likewise, several new novices applied for admission, not all of whom persevered, and in 1737, the first Passionist retreat or monastery was completed. From then on, the congregation began to flourish, although there was no shortage of trials and disappointments. In 1741, Benedict XIV approved the rules, somewhat mitigated, and immediately the number of vocations to the congregation increased. 6 years later, when the Passionists already had 3 houses, they met in general chapter. By then, the fame of their missions and the austerity of their life had spread throughout Italy. St. Paul himself evangelized almost all the cities of the Papal States and the region of Tuscany. The constant theme of his preaching was the Passion of Christ. With a cross in his hand and his arms outstretched, the saint spoke of the Lord's sufferings in a way that moved even the most hardened. When he violently disciplined himself in public for the sins of the people, he made even the soldiers and bandits weep. An officer who attended one of the missions confessed to the saint, "Father, I have been in many battles without even blinking at the thunder of the cannon, but the voice of your reverence makes me tremble from head to toe." The apostle treated penitents tenderly in the confessional, confirming them in their good resolutions, exhorting them to change their lives, and suggesting practical means to persevere on the right path. God showered St. Paul of the Cross with extraordinary gifts. The saint foretold the future, cured many sick people, and even during his mortal life, appeared on several occasions to people who were far away from where he was. In the cities, people swarmed around him, trying to touch him and to tear off a piece of his habit to keep as a relic, even though he refused to show any sign of veneration. In 1765, St. Paul was saddened to lose his brother John Baptist, from whom he had never been separated and with whom he was united by an extraordinary affection. Of very different temperaments, the two brothers complemented each other and strove together to acquire perfection. Since their ordination to the priesthood, they had gone to confession with each other, taking turns as judges. The only time they disagreed was the day John the Baptist dared to praise his brother in their presence. This wounded St. Paul's humility so deeply that he forbade his brother to speak to him, which turned out to be as hard a penance for one as for the other. The cloud of discord finally vanished on the 3rd day, when John the Baptist asked his brother's forgiveness on his knees. There was never again any difficulty between them. In memory of the friendship that had united them, Pope Clement XIV entrusted many years later to St. Paul of the Cross the Roman Basilica of St. John and St. Paul. In 1769, Clement XIV definitively approved the new congregation. St. Paul would have liked to retire to solitude at that time, for his health had weakened greatly, and the servant of God considered his task finished. But his sons were reluctant to change superiors, and the Pope, who had great affection for the saint, wanted him to spend some time in Rome. During his last years, St. Paul of the Cross devoted himself to the foundation of the Passionist sisters. After many difficulties, the first convent was inaugurated in Corneto in 1771, but the founder's poor health prevented him from attending the ceremony, and he never saw his spiritual daughters dressed in the habit. Feeling very ill, he asked the Pope for his blessing, but the pontiff replied that the Church needed him to live a few more years. St. Paul got a little better and lived for another 3 years. His death occurred on October 18, 1775, when he was 80 years old. His canonization took place in 1867, when the date of April 28th was established for his feast.